Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. Today's Ning talk is on advanced social sciences for community builders. My name is Allison Leahy, and I'm the community manager at Ning. I'm joined here by Crystal Coleman, a community consultant for Ning and co-producer of this series, and Richard Millington, your presenter for the hour. Advanced Social Sciences for Community Builders is Richard's 12th webinar for Ning. When we first approached Rich about doing a webinar for us 10 months ago, I don't think either of us knew how far we'd take the series and our partnership. And while we've introduced other incredible speakers to the lineup, like Patrick O'Keefe, Mark Siegel, and Breda Doherty, we are always excited to hear what Richard has to bring to the table. And today, Richard is going to take us beyond motivation and cover topics such as conformity, the bystander effect, and group polarization to explain how you can use proven scientific methods to build bigger, better, and more active communities. The goal of this webinar is to broaden your toolkit and help you develop tactics you can use to increase participation in your community. And there's a good chance you've joined us before, but for those who are new to Ning Talks, I'll just go over a few of our housekeeping notes. We will be live tweeting the event and encourage you to share any comments, quotables, and questions using the hashtag NingTalk, N-I-N-G-T-A-L-K. You may also submit your questions using the questions feature in GoToWebinar. Submit as many questions as you like during the course of the presentation, and we'll be saving some time at the end to share and discuss these questions with Richard. Tomorrow, I'll be sending out a link to the recording and inviting you all to continue the conversation on our blog at cultivate.ning.com or in our customer community at creators.ning.com. So thanks again for carving a little time out of your day to be with us. I'm very excited to introduce Richard Millington, who will take it away.
Thanks for that. Thanks a lot for that kind introduction. Can you put yourself on mute? Awesome. So welcome everyone, and good morning and good afternoon, depending upon where you are. So what we've done, or at least I hope what we've done over the last 11 to 12 webinars, is go through so many different types of elements of the community management framework. So the common questions such as how do you grow an online community? How do you increase the levels of activity? How do you come up with a community strategy? How do you measure a community? How do you moderate a community? We spent a lot of time going very deep into the different tactics that you can use. And what I want to do today is explain a lot of the social science that underpins the work that we do. Because every tactic or every intervention that you make in your community should be based upon some scientific principle that you know is going to work within that context. So the more you understand about the social science, the more you should, in theory, be able to build better communities and come up with your own tactics for your own community effort. So we're going to cover a lot of different things today, and there's no narrative throughout this webinar like there would be usually. Instead, we're going to jump from topic to different topic here and try and explain a little bit about the importance of each one of these. So what I think you'll find is that some things won't be relevant to your community, but there should certainly be at least one or two things in here that help you to build much better communities and help you come up with your tactics and strategies even better than what you do today. So today we're going to be covering around 16 different things. So that will include motivation, human behavior, the sense of community, which we've touched upon in the past, false consensus bias, social identity theory, and a lot of the different things that tend to come up very frequently, especially when you're trying to get your community to do certain things. The first one I want to talk about is motivation, because very frequently, the motivational appeals that we use to try and get someone to join and participate in a community aren't really aligned with how motivation works. Too often, when we try to get people to join or participate in a community, we use motivational appeals that are a nod towards the noble goals of the community. So to advance that field or to improve that topic in some way. And while this might work for existing established members of a community, it has a very limited effect upon getting people to either join or immediately participate within that community. So to understand how to do this, we need to understand how motivation works. And most people distinguish between two different types of motivation. The intrinsic motivation, so the intrinsic nature, or to be more specific, the joy of doing that task just for what that task is, the internal gratification, and the extrinsic motivation. So you do something because you get a reward. Most of us go to work in the morning because we get paid to do that work, not because we find it internally gratifying in any particular way, but because we're paid to do that work. Whereas, for example, most of us read books as a hobby or do any hobby because we enjoy the activity itself. So this is important for online communities for several reasons. First, intrinsic motivation is much more sustainable and longer term than extrinsic motivation. There's a terrific book called Punished by Rewards. And in the book, it explains how so many studies have shown that when you reward people for doing the tasks that they're already doing, the quality and the quantity of that performance drops. What tends to happen is that people, whilst initially they do respond to that reward, eventually the motivation of that reward, the motivational effect of that reward tends to drop. So what happens instead is that as the idea or the value of that reward drops, their level of work that they put into it also drops. So the level of participation declines over the long term. So if you're thinking about adding, say, gamification or tangible rewards or giving your top members gifts, what you might actually do is turn members who are intrinsically motivated in your community to be extrinsically motivated. And that will have a negative impact upon your community. We wrote a post on this recently on the Feverbeast site. And in the post, using academic studies that are available to everyone now, not studies that are created by gamification vendors, but independent academic studies of gamification, we showed that there's very little data right now that supports that gamification works within a community context. And this is really important because it's against what most people think. And it doesn't work because it extrinsically motivates participation. And it's not sustainable over the long term. So when you want people to participate, you genuinely want them to do it for internal reasons, for the intrinsic motivating factors. The next thing I want to talk about is the behavior model of a terrific academic called BJ Fogg. I do recommend that you visit his site, bjfogg.com. So what BJ Fogg has done is that he's looked at the nature of habits and persuasion and why people do certain things, and more importantly, how you change the behavior of groups of people at a time. One of the challenges when you're building a community is to get your members to visit that community on a regular basis, which means it takes time for visiting that community to become a habit. The challenge is that most members don't participate in a community long enough for it to become a habit. So they might visit once, they might visit twice, but it doesn't become a habit over the long term. And what this graph here tries to explain is that the certain triggers that you use or the certain reasons that people visit a community vary depending upon if they're highly motivated to do it or if the task itself is easy or difficult to do. So I hope this makes sense to everyone. So if they have a higher motivation, members are more willing to do things that are hard to do. And we'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. Whereas if they have a low motivation and it's easy to do, they're also likely to do it. But it's when you get caught in the middle, as most communities do, that you have to identify triggers that are going to get people to join and participate within that activity. So the motivation here that we're talking about is whether it involves pleasure or pain, or hope or fear, or social acceptance or rejection. These are the three core motivations of this model. In terms of ability, whether it's hard or difficult to do, the more time it takes to do it, the more money it costs, the greater the physical effort it takes, or a variety of other factors here, the harder it's going to be to get people to do it. And if you need a trigger, then you need something that people are going to see based upon their existing habits that they do right now that's going to get them to visit and participate in that community. We had a client some time ago, and we were really struggling to get their employees to participate within their own community. And we looked at the behavior of what these people did now to try and see if there was any trigger we could use within the existing behavior that we could bring into that community. And one of the things we noticed is that when they loaded up the internet, they went to the internal company page. So this was a default thing that was set up on every web browser. And we wondered what would happen if we changed that default page to the community page or to their membership page. So for every single person, whenever they loaded up that page to use the internet, they would automatically go to the community. This was a very simple trigger to use, and it certainly won't work for everyone. But you'll find that in many different types of organizations or within the groups you're trying to reach, there might be a specific trigger within the existing behaviors that members do right now that you can use to get them to participate. And you want triggers that are deeply embedded in the existing behaviors of what people do now. So Facebook is a very obvious example. When Facebook was initially launched, they used a lot of email notifications. And when people would join the community or the social network, they're nudged in very clever ways to invite their friends to join that community. So, same with Instagram and the tagging behavior. So until it becomes a habit, you need those regular triggers in place. So for some communities, it might be during lunch. So a lot of people, they visit or they browse the internet during their lunch break. And if that's the case, there's a trigger that you can use there to get people to visit during that particular time, to have some sort of activity or an event that takes place during that specific time. But it's very important to analyze your target audience and look at the behavior that they do already, and then identify what kind of triggers are going to work. The other things that you can do that are relevant to this model is to make the behavior itself as easy as possible to do. So if you want people to say, join your community, then making that activity as easy as possible to do helps a lot. So for motivation, you want to be using the right appeals in your communications and your concept. Appeals that are based around the pleasure or pain or the hope or fear or the social acceptance or rejection. Don't use appeals that encourage people to visit your community just to consume information. Make sure that you're using appeals that get people not only to join the community, but to get them to participate within that community. So if you're using appeals, so for example, where members can build their status within the community or to build their reputation, that's not always a bad appeal, because when people join a community, they're already primed in that mindset to participate, to build their reputation. That's the only way that they can do it. To increase the ability of people, you can do two different things. The first one is to train people to do the task, but this is incredibly hard to do. Almost nobody wants to sit through any training whatsoever, especially when it comes to using a community platform. Or better, you can simplify the task that's required. And the third, as we covered already, is to identify the existing habits and embrace these in your community. Within every audience, there'll always be some habit that you can use, that you can latch onto, especially to do with the topic itself, that's going to get people to join and participate. So a friend of mine runs a community in the pickup artist space, which is a very competitive space. And one of the triggers that he uses is that after people go out at night and they try to talk to girls and get their phone numbers or whatever, what he found is that if he could get people to report on how that went to the rest of the community, it became a natural trigger to get people to join and to get advice and expertise. So they were primed when they came home every night to visit the community and report how it went. So very often, whatever that topic is, the moment just before or just after they have engaged or participated in that topic in some way can be an excellent trigger to get people to join your community. So if you can create a place for that within your community, you're very likely to get more people joining and participating. The next thing I want to talk about is the sense of community. So if you know our work at all, you know that we spend a lot of time talking about the sense of community. And the reason we spend a lot of time talking about this is that it is the most misunderstood concept in community development. And it's something that most community professionals completely ignore. We spend a lot of time talking about the number of members, the levels of activity, the return on investment, but we spend very little time discussing whether the people that we're actually trying to reach, the people within that group, do they actually feel a psychological sense of community with other people? Do they genuinely feel that they are a part of that community? And this is important because the organizations with the the communities rather, with the strongest sense of community had the highest number of contributions. The oldest communities in the world are, not coincidentally, those with the highest sense of community. Other things you find is that organizations or communities, the highest sense of community, also had the highest levels of advocacy. If you want members sharing more knowledge or expertise or visiting that community more frequently, then it helps when they have a very strong sense of community. Communities that last the longest have the strongest sense of community. So it makes sense as community professionals that we get really good at understanding what constitutes a sense of community. And this is an academic concept which is being studied in great detail over the years. And it comprises of 4 separate elements. The first one is membership. So can you identify the other members of that community? Do you feel similar to those members of the community? Do you feel like you have influence within that community? If your members don't feel like they can influence the community in any significant way, they stop participating within that community. People only make contributions to see the impact of those contributions. If they can't see any impact of their contributions, then they stop participating. The third is the integration and fulfillment of needs. Are the needs of the individual participating aligned with the goals of the community? So when someone participates in the community, are they satisfying their social needs? Are their egos being satisfied within that community? Are they getting the self-validation that they need? And finally, do you feel the same emotions as the other members of that community? The strongest communities have a very strong shared emotional connection. They oscillate at what we call the same emotional frequency, which means they feel the same emotions at the same time. Now, as a community professional, you have a great deal of influence over each one of these. So you can make the barrier to entry of that community more explicit. You can raise a boundary to participating in that community, which means you exclude more members, but in exchange, you get members that feel a stronger sense of community with each other. Most organizations that we work with should take this route. They should make their community a little bit more exclusive and a little bit more focused than what it is right now. You can also do more to help people within your community have greater influence within that community. You can provide tasks that members can do to help the community. You can give them guest columns, posts, and other areas of the community that they can have control over. You can interview them, you can profile them, you can feature them in different ways within your community. I know we spent a lot of time covering this already, so I'm not going to dwell on it today. So you have a great deal of influence over these things. If you want, for example, your members to feel a stronger shared emotional connection with one another, then you can influence that by having the types of discussions that's going to provoke happiness, sadness, or anger within your community. You can bring in more of those controversial discussions within your sector into your specific community. So let's move ahead. So next we're going to talk about the false consensus bias. Some of you, if you've got any sort of academic background at all, then you should be very familiar with what this is. The false consensus bias is two different things, which is first is that people believe they know what others are thinking. So when you're within a group, we typically tend to believe that people feel the same way that we do about the same topics that we do, which means that the vocal members of your community, they often believe they speak on behalf of everyone. And this has some consequences within your community, as we covered in the metrics lesson, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago now. The first consequence is that a vocal minority who might be complaining about a particular issue might believe they represent the community. Or more so, because people that disagree with them don't see anyone else that is supporting their view, then they don't speak up themselves, which leads to a spiral of silence where only the people that agree with the vocal members actually speak out at all, which means a very vocal minority of your community can influence the majority of the community, or perhaps even you, to take actions or activities that they shouldn't be doing. And the only way to avoid this is to ask people directly for their opinions. So you need to reach out to beyond that vocal minority and get the opinions of the other people within the group, or you can validate whether the vocal minority reflects your community through a survey to your whole community, via the direct outreach, or by polls of some sort. So everyone has the opportunity to give their voice without having to display it to the rest of the community. The next thing we're going to talk about is social identity theory. This is something that I recommend you do a lot of reading on because it influences a lot of what you should be doing within your community. When we join a community, we give up a part of our own identity to embrace that group identity. Whether this is an online or offline community, we give up a part of our own identity to embrace that group identity. So that group identity then is part of the makeup of how we view ourselves. So we form our identities from the groups, or usually the one group that we typically belong to or feel that we belong to. And if the group fails, if it loses momentum in some way, our image of ourselves is downgraded to a certain extent, which means that we gradually disassociate ourselves from communities that look like they're not successful. This is especially true online. If your online community does not look like that is successful, then very few people want to associate their identity with it. And if very few people want to associate their identity with their unsuccessful group, then it means that your community is always unsuccessful. But this presents a certain chicken and the egg situation for you. Until your community is successful, no one wants to join and participate in that community. So how do you get over that initial hump? Well, one of the things you can do straight away is to remove every discussion or category or feature within your community that's not highly used. Make sure that only the parts of the community that are working, that do have some discussions taking place, are visible to the rest of the community. And second, as we often preach in the process of developing a community, is to build up a group of 50 to 150 prospective members of that audience and get them to be the first founding members of the community. Tell them very early on that they're going to be the founding members of the community, so they have a level of buy-in and ownership over what that community is going to be. And what you'll find is that if you can create a sense of momentum, if you can document and tell the community about its own successes, you'll find that people want to participate more and more because the group begins to seem more and more successful. And the more successful that group is, the more we want to associate our own identity with that group identity. This is a very basic overview here of the social identity theory, but I recommend that you do a lot more reading on this. The next thing is group polarization, which if you're based in the USA, you should know an awful lot about right now, which is generally when two sides debate an issue. Instead of coming together and identifying what the differences are and resolving them, what tends to happen is that the issue polarizes the opinion further apart. So people become more entrenched in their own viewpoint. This makes it very difficult to resolve any issue via that sort of discussion. And this is especially true when the group identity is in some way based around what that debate is. So if you're a Republican or a Democrat right now, there are certain core fundamental beliefs that when you debate them, so for example, gun control, it's a part of that group identity. Your beliefs on that are part of that group identity. So you're less likely than ever to come closer to your to the other group that you're debating with. And this can be very devastating to a community when two people want to have any sort of debate, because if they have that debate, it tends to spiral wildly out of control really quickly. So there are some things that you can do here. First is to accept that there are a diversity of opinions and accept that you can have intense, tough debates and set very strict rules for this. This won't change the attitudes of that group, it won't bring that group any closer together. But what it will do is that it will be a place where members can go and have fun debating that issue, and believe me, for a lot of members, this will be fun. Or even better, what you can do is to have a debate, imagined or otherwise, against an opposition group to that community itself. So almost every community has some sort of opposition group whose views are diametrically opposed to their own. So you can use these within your own community and have discussions about that topic that's likely to bring that community closer together because they're discussing the things that they generally agree on. Next, we're going to talk about group performance. This you will remember from any group work that you have to do in school or college or anything like that. Broadly, if our work is independently judged and assessed, we work much harder than what we do if the work isn't independently judged. If we're only rated as one single group, then we don't participate anywhere near as much. So this is very difficult because when you want your community to do some activity, they're less likely to do it if it's not individualized in some way. So if you're not asking specific members to do specific things by a specific time, what you're going to find is that less people want to participate. So what you want to be doing here is throwing the spotlight on members for their contributions towards that task. And this is especially true in, say, a community of practice, where you want members to advance the cause, or a community of action where you want members to tackle milestones towards achieving a particular goal. So you need to individualize those contributions from the masses and throw the spotlight upon members that are doing the things that you want them to do. The next thing we're going to speak about is bystander apathy. I did a talk in Australia about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and my plan for the talk was to show how social sciences can influence any group of individuals, even to an extent that we don't think it would do. And one of the things I was planning to do during that talk was to have an actor who, right at the beginning of my talk, sitting very near the front, would just collapse. And my plan was to just carry on speaking. And the purpose of this was to show that if whilst a couple of people would react, most people in that situation would copy what everyone else is doing, which would be not reacting, because there would be certain social cues that were taking place there. Despite how everyone coming into the room, if you asked them if someone collapsed during a talk, would you go to help? Everyone would say yes. In the actual situation, most people don't do that. I unfortunately had to abandon this plan for the talk when my wife suggested it wouldn't be a great idea to have someone drop dead during my talk. But I still think that this would have been a very interesting experiment to do. So this is important because, again, in your community, you want to be naming specific people that you want to do things. And only then, once people see other people that are already doing it, will the rest of them engage in that activity. So you want to be naming specific people that you want to do the activities or tasks that you need done within your community to break that bystander apathy effect. The next thing, and something that we see very often within communities, is conformity. Conformity is a notion that in a group setting, people ignore their own beliefs and conform to the group's beliefs. They might not often agree with the group's beliefs, but their actions conform to the group's beliefs. What this does is breeds harmony within that group. So it allows that group to get along. It eases all the friction that can arise when lots of different people are interacting together. The problem with this is that it can make a group very stale and very boring very quickly. So what you need to be doing is pushing the community through this. You need to be bringing out people that don't agree with what a lot of the community, what a lot of the people in the community agree on. So this gives you other perspectives within that group. And what you find when you do this is that you get a lot of activity within that community very quickly, because you're going to have hundreds of other people that will also support this individual. They just haven't had anyone leading the way on that. So you want to be ensuring that if there are sacred milestones that your community agrees on, that nearly everyone agrees on, what happens when you begin challenging that? What happens when you invite someone to give a viewpoint that disagrees with that? Then you make that a sticky thread within your community. Then you write content about that topic as well. So you quickly find that you can push the community through these discussion topics. The next one, I'm sure most of you have heard of this already, is cognitive dissonance. Put simply, this is where we rationalize what we have done because we don't want to feel bad about the things that we have done. We don't want to live with that cognitive dissonance, that feeling, that bad feeling in some particular way. So for example, if we've spent a lot of money on a car and it's not performing in the way that we think that it should be doing, instead of allowing ourselves to experience that cognitive dissonance, we rationalize it and say that perhaps we like the way it looks, or we like the way it handles, or we focus on the things that we like, or why it was a good purchase, or anything else like that, so we can rationalize away that cognitive dissonance. What this means within a community setting is that the more that people participate, the more that they will continue to participate because they don't want to feel like they have wasted their time participating within that community. You see this a lot in rituals and traditions to join in a fraternity, for example, where people have to go through hell or some of the most humiliating things that can happen to a person to be accepted within that group. And as a result, studies have shown that they like and appreciate that group more. Now, obviously, that doesn't change what happens in the group at all. But what it does do is that it makes sure that people rationalize the reason for going through all that horrific experience in many situations, so they can join that group. So what you want to be doing is soliciting a lot of investments within your community. These will be time investments and there will be emotional investments. So you get people into the habit of participating on a regular basis and building up a lot of very small investments within your community. So over time, people are keen to continue participating and making ever greater numbers of contributions and ever greater increases in the quality of contributions, because they don't want to feel like they've wasted their time in what they've done already. The next one is attribution bias. So the attribution bias is where we attribute our own mistakes to the situation or the environment that we're in, whereas we attribute the mistakes or the errors of other people to their own personality defects. Generally speaking, the situation that people are in plays a bigger role in their behavior than their personality does. So most people react the same way to the same situations. And you see this every single day. But this is important because from a community context, you have an incredible power to change or shape that situation. So if you want more people to get along within your community, you can create that collaboration environment. You can change what people see within that community. You can change what touch points people have within that community. You can create common goals or common enemies within that community. So then as a result, people are far more likely to react to that situation, regardless of what their own personality is. So there are lots of things you can do to manipulate your community in different ways here. But the key thing is that you should be changing and tweaking that environment that members see to guide people towards the behavior that you want them to do. Next up, and I warned you there was no narrative through this at all. This is very much a collection of social sciences, which is very relevant for your community building efforts. So next one is a minimal groups paradigm. This is essentially the notion that groups can form from pretty much anything. This was done by a study some time ago where people, when they came to the front of a line, they tossed a coin, and if it was heads, they went in one group. If it was tails, they went in a different group. But over time, they very quickly demonstrated greater loyalty to their own group or greater feeling of attachment to their own group than the opposite group, even though there were no specific bonding activities. Simply by flicking a coin right in front of the individual and then determining what group that they would go in, they felt a greater attachment through to their own group. What this means is that people naturally form groups. And if there is no existing groups, if there is no opposite sides, your members will very often naturally split into their own groups. And sometimes this can be a very beneficial thing, but very frequently it's not. It can lead to a lot of infighting within the community. What you might want to consider doing is creating opposite groups or the different groups deliberately within your community. So breaking and fracturing the community in different ways to create the right sorts of groups. And this will be groups that are based around the demographics of members, so perhaps their age or their gender or their location. So you'll quite often find there are subgroups within a community for people that are under 35 and interested in that topic, or people that are 50 plus or interested in that topic, or people that are interested in that topic and live in Chicago or Washington or New York. So you can create these groups within your community. You also find that groups can be based around the habits that people do. So what do they spend most of their time doing? What sort of jobs do they have? Or you can find that it's based around their psychographics. So what do they like or dislike within that topic? What are the biggest challenges that they face? So you can intentionally, and you should do as your community progresses through the life cycle, break your community apart into a large number of smaller groups that you can then use to build a much stronger community over the long term. Next up, we have roles and what's called the labeling effect. The labeling effect is based upon a series of studies done back in the 70s, I believe, where they found that if they gave someone a label, so for example, hardworking or ambitious or lazy, people instantly became that label. People become the expectations that people have of them. So this is important from a community building perspective because you can create expectations of your members and you have to individualize this to a certain extent. So that means giving people roles within the community or telling them the characteristics that you think of them, and you should always make these as positive as possible. Or tell the people they are what you want them to be. So if you want them to be the top expert within the community, when you very early on, after perhaps one or two contributions, start implying that people are one of the top experts within the community, they become that. They contribute more and more, and they become that role or they become that label that you give them. So this is a very powerful tool that you can use within your community to generate a lot of great advice, activity, and knowledge exchange as well. Simply give people the labels that you want them to be in the future of your community. Next up, we have leadership. So a lot of community managers, when they join a new online community or when they become the community manager of a new community, they try to make big changes very early on. And they usually get a lot of resentment, or they usually cause a lot of resentment towards themselves personally, because to the rest of the community, they're still perceived as an outsider. And because they're an outsider, they get that rejection. It feels like the community is being changed by an outsider who isn't a part of the group. And people hate change at the best of times. So, what new community managers typically need to do is to what's called toe the line before trying to lead. Try and fit in and blend in with the rest of the community before being or trying to make any major changes or being the leader of that group in any major way. So you want to be accepted as a member of that community before trying to do anything big. Or to use a more common quote, seek to understand the community before trying to be understood yourself. Another thing we encounter a lot is groupthink. Broadly speaking, people from similar backgrounds can't think entirely outside the box. People become locked into their own thinking. This is why a lot of the innovation that tends to happen in a lot of different sectors actually comes from outside of that sector. The common quote that goes around is that farmers didn't invent the tractor. They were so busy thinking of farming through one particular frame of reference that they didn't see the big other thing that was coming along the way. And so the challenge that you'll have to do is for new ideas is to deliberately encourage and seek out new thinking. And that might be difficult because you are part of that group think as well. You are likely to have a very similar background to the people that you're trying to reach, which means you might want to be looking at the other sectors that are around you. You might want to be looking at the Google Trends site and seeing what new trends are rising that might be relevant to your community, and then bringing people into your community that can speak and can talk about that specific topic. People that can write columns, initiate discussions, and otherwise be involved in supporting that change within your broader community to break the community out of that groupthink. Okay, we're coming to the end of this now. So next one is self-disclosure. So we covered this in a lot of depth when we talked about how to initiate and sustain discussions within your community. Real relationships, I mean real relationships, not just liking or things like that, are based upon reciprocated self-disclosure. If you look at how a relationship develops, almost every relationship follows a very similar path. First, two people will meet and interact around a topic that they have in common. That might simply be the location that they both happen to be in at the same time. It might be a certain life experience that they're going through or common interests that they have. But they'll interact around that. And then over a period of time, sometimes quite quickly, sometimes over a much longer period of time, what happens is that they begin to reveal information about themselves. They will begin to reveal things that they've done in the past, or their opinions on different topics, or their emotions, or their experiences, or a bunch of other things about themselves. And when they reveal these things and it's reciprocated by the other person, it begins to breed trust between those two individuals. And so what happens over a period of time, that trust builds up into the solid relationships or the friendships that we consider so important to the day-to-day lives or our day-to-day social lives. But within communities, you want people building real relationships. People have to feel like they know and they care about the other people within that group if they're going to continue participating within that group. If they want to feel that they are a part of that peer group, then they need to have that reciprocated trust with at least a few other with a few of the other people within that community. So you can help facilitate this by asking, facilitating, and highlighting the questions that provoke levels of self-disclosure. So when there's a question that asks someone for their opinions on a particular topic, or more importantly, to reveal their own experiences or characteristics about themselves, You can highlight those sorts of discussions and nudge more people to participate in those sorts of discussions. Next up, we have procrastination, which should be something most of us have experienced at least once in our lives. And from a community perspective and from the individual perspective, I'm not going to dwell on this because it's being discussed to death and back. From a community perspective, if you give your community a really large goal, it can be very bad for that community because it can require a lot of work and it seems very far away. And especially if you run a community of action, what you do want is to establish very small, very achievable goals. Well, what you want, especially in the very early stages of getting that community going, are some very simple, very small, very quick wins that your community can achieve within a couple of weeks at most, perhaps even less than that. Because once you get those quick wins going, you build up that momentum. Other things you can do is that you can look to see what your community has done already, look to see the knowledge that they've shared, and see that from this knowledge, you've got half a book already written. Just use the best advice of your members. So when you can tell your members they're already more than 50% of the way there, they are far more likely to continue doing this. If you've ever filled out your LinkedIn profile, for example, you know that LinkedIn only tells you how far you've gone down this process when you're more than 50% of the way there. So you can cheat a little bit here, but just a little. And finally, the new best friend theory, which is essentially the idea that in new environments, the first person that you meet often becomes your best friend, in quotes, within that specific social environment. And this is relevant because you can carefully structure who members first meet in that community. You can determine to a certain extent if members are going to see someone that they're likely to get along with very early on. You can have volunteers that reach out to members within that community who are friendly and are very good at getting those members to participate within that community. It doesn't have to be you, but it should be someone that is likely to engage them, someone that is as similar to them as possible, and someone that is very good at getting them to make their first contribution within that community within a very short amount of time. So that wraps up this webinar for today. If you have any questions, now's the time to ask.
Great, thank you so much, Rich. That was really fun for me. I've taken some social psychology and social science classes, but it definitely helps to pull all 16 of these concepts together and just review them one after the other. Let's see, it doesn't look like we have too many questions coming in, but I definitely would like to know a bit more about how over time you've kind of identified these concepts as the most important for community building, and maybe some resources you might be able to point us to if we're interested in learning more.
Sure. So in terms of, sorry, can you mute yourself?
Yes.
So in terms of identifying which ones are most relevant, this was entirely subjective based upon our experiences. What we spend a lot of hours doing every week is reading the types of academic journals which no one in their right mind should really spend their time reading. And what we look at are things that we've seen work in online communities. So how do these things apply within a community context? Which seem to apply and which don't? And we're very fortunate that we have some terrific academics like Cliff Lamp, Ryan Butler, Rob Kraut, and many more in that line who have done terrific work in studying what specifically applies to communities and what doesn't. So we tend to use the ones that seem most relevant there. In terms of learning more, the Google Scholar site is good, so scholar.google.com. And if you type in a variety of terms related to communities, you'll find so much information and so much data there that is terrible if you don't spend time reading this. There are some terrific blogs as well, like the Situationist is a really terrific blog. Psyblog, psyblog.com. and a bunch of others as well. There's also some great sociology blogs, which I'll have to dig up after that and find the URLs, which are very good. And there are some terrific books. So the Group Processes book, I can't remember who the authors are, is good. The Introduction to Social Psychology book, the third edition of that, is really good. So there's some terrific books around that you can use as well.
Great, thanks. Definitely love the Google Scholars site. Often, it's especially the farther away I am from my college days, the more I crave the academic literature that I don't really get to dive into that often. So if you're in a similar position, definitely Google Scholars is a good place to go. And we've got a question from Crystal here.
I think one thing that really resonated with people in your talk was this vicious circle, as Elif put it, of no one wanting to join or engage with what looks like an unsuccessful community. So I was wondering if you could touch on that again and expand upon your thoughts on ways to focus on the more successful parts of your community.
Sure. So there are two parts to that. As I'm guessing most people here have experienced, it's very hard to get the community off the ground because there's no one there. And if there's no one there, then no one wants to join. The way we get around that with our clients is that first we tell them to build relationships up with around 50 to 150 members of that target audience before they launch the community. So we typically make them spend 3 months, possibly longer than that, just reaching out to these individuals, building those relationships, and making sure by the time that the platform is ready and everything else is in place, they have all these people who know them and trust them and will participate because they have a commitment to the individual rather than a commitment to the community. And the reason why we did that is because about 2 years ago now, we published a free ebook, which you can send a link on here, called the Proven Path, which was entirely about getting a community off the ground. And we interviewed a lot of people that had launched their own communities and made them very successful. And what we found in our research is that every single person who was successful had built up a large number of relationships before they launched a community. Very often they were prominent participants within that sector already. So when they launched it, they had a lot of people who they could naturally reach out to. So this is something that we go through with our clients to make sure that they're building all these relationships. So by the time that they launch the community, they have all these people that they can invite to join the community. But more than that, to provide some of the motivation here, we try and get them to ask the members to be the founding members of the community. Because if you're a founding member, A, you're more motivated because, hey, this is the community that I founded. But B, you're also ready and you expect there not to be that much activity in the first place. So as a result, you're accepting of that and you're not going to run away because there's no activity. Instead, you see it as a challenge for you to generate that activity and to get that activity going. So that's what's worked best for us and our clients in the past, and hopefully it will work best for a lot of the people here as well. In terms of making the community appear active, what we're doing now with one of our communities, communitygeek.com, is we're making sure that the community seems as active as possible. So we launched it quite recently. It's got a couple of posts every day, maybe 5 posts a day, which is a number that we're happy with right now. But what we do, for example, if we initiate a discussion and it gets no responses, we remove it because it's not a popular discussion, and the last thing we want is to see a lot of dead discussions within that community. If a member launches or initiates a discussion, we make sure that there are several responses to it, even if that means responding ourselves. So when other people visit that community, they see a lot of responses there to the existing discussions. And we try to launch with as few features as possible, so we're concentrating activity in as smaller place as possible. So we make sure that the community has what we call a very high social density. So there's as many people participating within that any given area of the community as possible.
Great, thanks for that response, Rich. I'd guess that even though, some communities, well, every community will take quite a while to really take off and gain traction and get that those high levels of activity, social density, but also the volume of members kind of people are shooting for. When you start creating all the great content, it's definitely okay to repurpose that, I think. So you don't have to do duplicate work. Sometimes you can generate conversations around, items you may have brought up in the beginning when there weren't as many opinions being voiced.
Yeah, sure. I mean, in the very early stages of a community, most people don't see what happens. So, I mean, if you don't get a big response to a discussion that you posted or an article that you shared very early on, you can share it later simply because it's likely most people didn't see it. So yeah, that's perfectly fine.
Awesome. All right, I have a question from Steve Baker here. Steve wants to know how you would apply these social items to developing a massive open online course, or MOOC.
A MOOC.
If you could highlight any of the differences and maybe where to start and what a good workflow might be.
Can you repeat the question again?
Absolutely. So Steve is developing a massive open online course, and he's wondering how to apply some of these same social science principles to the MOOC. Basically, I'm curious if you have any ideas of where to start and what might be a good workflow.
So that's such a big, broad question, Steve. So a MOOC isn't so much different from many other types of communities, other than people have that instantly recognizable purpose from being there. What we would try to focus on is developing a sense of community amongst a group very early on, and making sure that together they're building up a series of small, quick wins, things that they've learned or achieved or otherwise done within that group that builds that momentum going and gets that momentum going. So instantly, people want to associate themselves more with that group as a result. I don't think there are too many differences from any other type of community. But I don't have enough time to cover that question in depth. So if you email me, richard@feedb.com, I'll try and respond in some more depth with some examples for you.
All right, great. Let's see. So just a couple more questions here. This one I know you've covered in some other topics and blog posts, but maybe you could speak to the kind of welcome process. Michael wonders if you personally use a series of welcome emails when someone joins, or if that is too impersonal and you should adopt a more personal email series and style.
Sure. So we tend to do a combination of both, depending upon if the community is old or if it's relatively new. In an inception stage community, in a community that is quite young and doesn't have that many members that are joining in every day, then it's pretty simple to reach out individually to people that have joined, to do some research on them via LinkedIn, Twitter, and get a very good feel for who they are and tailor an introduction towards them. But then the key thing about that confirmation email or that welcome email is to guide them instantly towards contributing within that community. You have a very short window here, maybe up to 15 minutes, to convert a newcomer into an active participant of that community. And if they don't do that within that time frame, you're typically going to find that they become a lurker more than they do a participant. As your community grows and develops, what we tend to use are welcome emails set on a autoresponder. So what we mean by that is that after a member has been a member for say X number of days or has made X number of contributions, they're sent a automatic email by the community platform that tells them a little bit more about the culture of the community or the history of their community or just some more information. Again, in a smaller online community, you can do this individually, And even in larger communities, it's very rare that you have a community with, say, thousands of members that are reaching this stage every day. So you can usually do it personally instead. It very much depends on what size and how mature your community is.
All right, thank you very much, Richard. That was fantastic. I think we covered most of the questions here, and we're just creeping past 10 a.m. Pacific time. So I know you all have busy lives, and I want to thank you again for joining us. I will be sending a link to the recording in a follow-up email tomorrow, and we'll also write a few leading questions and comments if you want to continue the conversation over on cultivate.ning.com.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Goodbye.